Hello and welcome to Truly Tragic Transits with me, Rebecca Lovett. In today's episode, we explore the energetics behind the untimely passing of actor and director Heath Ledger, as we explore whether his fate was in fact written in the stars, or whether the celestial energetics indicate where help was needed in order to transcend the weight of the time. So who was Heath Ledger, and what do we know from the public domain? Heath Ledger passed away at approximately 3 p.m. Eastern Time on the 22nd of January 2008 in SoHo, New York. Known for his incredible ability to touch films with magic and take on a character through his infectious method acting style, it came as a shock to the world to find out that such a talent at only 28 years of age had passed away suddenly in his New York apartment. Through this podcast, I want to explore death from a different angle. This is not about science, not about toxicology reports or measurable objectives and outcomes, but about humans exploring the spectrum of shadow and light and how these invisible energies from our birth chart, combined with the current of the neutrino stream we walk and breathe, and the earth we tread, play out in real life. This podcast explores the vulnerabilities of people in the public eye through energetic empathy and asks, is there something else going on here? Because for me, a lot of these shocking celebrity stories teach us a lesson of how brilliant but fragile humans really are on this planet we call home, and how we can better understand the subtle energetics to create more meaning to life and to death. So born on the 4th of April 1979 at 6:30am in Perth, Australia, Heath was born under an Aries sun, giving him an Aries sun, an Aries rising and a Cancer moon sign. So instantly you can see this go-getter with a deeply sensitive soul inside, a wonderful energy to observe. Often described by his friends and family during his early life as a risk taker and living on the edge somewhat, this shouldn't come as much of a surprise with a strong Aries influence in his chart, living on his sun line, if we look through Astrocartography lenses. Literally acting out the archetype of Aries on the sun line, we'd see the light side of this. So his natal sun also sits in the first house, bringing that spicy Aries personality into full view. Impulsive, reckless, but a heck of a good time, and never in one place for too long either. Aries placements often tell us the story of erratic bursts of energy. It's the first sign of the zodiac and the starting engine for spring energy. If that doesn't describe his boundless energy and potential for an easy burnout, especially as a projector in human design, I don't know what does. His natal chart also reveals an inspired traveller. With Neptune in Sagittarius, his creativity and potential in that area would need to be fed by adventure, full stop. He was a born wanderer, born to be a nomad, and to seek inspiration from different people and places he would wander to. Alongside a human design gate 56 and the full channel of curiosity, which is the 1156, he would always need to be inspired, something which can become quite tiring and lead to disconnect from the, let's call it, more boring day-to-day aspects of life. In a shadow sense, this can be a vulnerability. What can happen when this combination is we shy away from responsibility and stability because it will feel flat. So with his natal Mars, ruler of Aries, also in a precarious position in the 12th house, this would also add to the shadow work available, the recklessness, the impulsivity, the impatience. The key is to recognise when adventure is needed, and when we just need to be present and in the moment as well. It may also prove problematic when we structure in, when more structure is needed in life. So, for example, when it comes to relationships and family, where we need to anchor ourselves somewhat and where we can be free. It's a balance, especially when there are dependents involved. We can't always necessarily be anchored and have full freedom at the same time. In summary though, this was someone who wasn't really going to live a boring life or a disinterested life from the very get-go. However, This episode isn't about dissecting his birth chart to show what an incredible man he was. We know all of that. We've seen the films, we've felt the magic of the Joker, we fell in love with the teenage dirtbag in 10 Things I Hate About You. We can see that strong creative and sensitive energy. This podcast is about the energetics of death, and exploring the energetics of death to answer big questions in life. Does destiny exist? Is our story written in the stars? Are we able to control our destiny? And what free will and choice do we actually have? This podcast is about potential and how we choose to work with that energetic potential for better or for worse. So let's fast forward to that fateful day in January 2008. I remember exactly where I was, much like many of these deaths we're exploring in season 1. I was in sixth form at the time. I would have been in the first year. And I was in a taxi on the way to school when everyone was talking about it. And I must admit, I wasn't really much of a Heath Ledger fan. I didn't really know his work, so I wasn't quite aware that this was like a big cult moment. And just to bear in mind, The Dark Knight hadn't quite come out, I don't think, yet. And as I travelled in the taxi and I watched my friends mourn someone that they didn't know through the sharing of stories and the shock in their body language, I was quite curious. There's always something about death that has drawn me in. I have my Sun and my Jupiter in the 12th house. My Pluto is in Scorpio directly on the IC. I am so incredibly curious about death and the mysteries of life. But what I'm most curious about is what death actually is and how we can begin to understand these energetics behind tragic deaths in a different way, outside of the science, and leave more questions than answers. That's really what I'm truly interested in. Back to his passing. We know that during this time Heath was flying to and from London and New York as he filmed his final film, The Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus. And whilst there, he'd picked up some sort of chest infection. So this is the first thing we're going to investigate energetically. Often when we look at health through an astro-energetic lens, we can begin to see patterns emerging. Within a human design context, he was completely open G-center, showing susceptibility to the lungs or of the lungs. A side note, this would also explain his uncanny ability to be able to pick up and live as a character. The absolute powerhouse of an open G-center is that method acting style, to be able to just pick up and live as different characters. He was also a personality Sun main gate 21, and this gate 21 is linked to the lungs again. If something was off in his environment or in his life, it was probably going to show up in his lungs. His lungs would be the kind of physical manifestation to display that. Especially if it was around emotional themes of safety and control, two strong energies linked to his cave's environment and the gate 21. And also Saturn, which I'll come to later. It wouldn't surprise me if he suffered with his breathing, suffered with his lungs, with chest infections regularly, or at least more often than normal. Looking further into the astrology though, Heath was suffering from his normal bout of insomnia, as well as chest infection of some sort, and was on prescription drugs to help. We know gate 11 within human design causes a whirling mind, combined with a full moon, traditionally a time when a lot of people suffer with sleep, suffer with intense feelings as well. This was someone with a strong moon emphasis in their chart as well. They've got a major cancer placement in there. Whenever I hear chest infections, though, or reoccurring respiratory infections, I'm curious about what's going on in Gemini and what's going on in the 3rd house from a natal perspective. And whenever I hear I can't sleep, I'm also curious about Gemini 3rd house or Virgo 6th house placements in the natal chart, but also as well in the transiting chart, what's transiting those houses. So let's begin there. What we see first is Heath's moon sitting in the 3rd house. With a moon in Cancer, he's already sensitive to moon movements, emotional intensity. But on a very practical level, this is someone who needs stability and safety to turn off their mind. If they're in between places and time zones often, this is really going to play with their natural ability to sleep, of course. But really, this is someone who, with this combination, who craves nighttime routine and stability, which we can see from their chart, whether they know that or not. This is going to be much more intense than just, I don't sometimes get to sleep at night. Now, I feel like it's important to mention here that this was a full moon in Leo on the day. So sitting in 1 degree of Leo and in gate 56, the gate of the wanderer or the gate of the adventurer, which holds significance in his chart. This puts natal activation into his 4th house, the house of family, and a concentrated illumination on the rawness of romance and children. Within this range, his natal Jupiter would also be activated, bringing an intense surge towards his emotions, with his Jupiter sitting in Cancer, where his natal moon is also sitting. And with this being a full moon, there's the most intense emotions of the month for someone with a heavy moon and emotional emphasis in their chart. If someone is emotionally volatile, I would really be recommending tracking moon cycles, especially for Cancer moon, sun, rising signs, and for emotional authorities within human design. Actually, for any water placements, especially within the chart. So that also goes for Scorpio, so Scorpio sun, moon, rising, and for Pisces sun, moon, rising as well. The moon can hold so many clues for the ebb and flow of the emotional tide and bring in some perspective to the emotional intensities felt. And it can crucially give the perspective of, it's not me, it's the moon, this too shall pass, which can also really help in processing emotions and help us steer away from the shadows of his chart of recklessness and impulsivity, with Mars in that 12th house, Mars being his chart ruler. There are several pulls on our energy body during a full moon. The moon is pulling us towards it, the sun is pulling it towards it, and the earth is pulling us down. We're being stretched in 3 different directions. And this is often what causes the instability in our emotional and mental health during this time of a full moon. Lunatic literally comes from the word luna, meaning moon. This isn't a new phenomenon, but it just seems that it's something we've forgotten about in our modern world, and we appear to believe that we are bigger or above the energetic tides we are subjected to or that we swim in. And for me, stories like Heath's perfectly illustrate our need to connect back to moon movements and understand our emotional health much more deeply. What we also see when we flip to the Astrocartography natal chart of Heath is his moon line sits almost exactly over New York City. And this is really curious. If you know the moon plays such an integral part in your ability to sleep, and the intense emotions that you feel and experience in this ebb and flow of energy, would you choose to live there? Would you choose to subject yourself to that on a daily basis? I personally wouldn't, unless I was very well versed in my emotions and in my emotional understanding and my understanding of the moon cycles, something which the majority of us just aren't. I do wonder if his sleep was worse on the East Coast, especially if his emotional health wasn't great with that moon line sitting there. I'd also be really curious to know whether his insomnia he suffered was more intense at certain moon periods. For example, the waxing gibbous and full moon and the new moon actually tend to be the worst times for sleep but the best times for creativity. It can also be times when depression or anxiety swing and switch between the two. This would certainly be something I'd advise people tracking with strong water energy in their chart, or those living on or close to their moon lines. So through that combination, we have someone who has a naturally active and nocturnal mind with a sensitivity to light coming through the human design chart, lacking in routine and stability, which was needed for various reasons, but mainly his human design environment being caves. His nervous system would be at its best in the darkness, with a priority being placed on physical and emotional safety, with little anchors to keep him in that safe space, with a body absorbing all sorts of prescription drugs for the upkeep of an unstable work life, and with an undefined spleen as well. The spleen energetically supporting the lymphatic system and ridding the toxins from the body. The undefined spleen really, if it's unsupported, it can be inconsistent in processing of medication and toxins and anything, including alcohol, things like that. We can then start to see problems building, right? We can see layer after layer coming into view based on the energetics that we knew were incoming. So within human design, we also observed that 1156 channel. The gate 11 is one of the most pesky in the human design chart. It comes up with endless ideas, a never-ending stream of ideas. Idea after idea after idea, it will just whirl and twirl. The key for working with this gate 11, if you've got it, is to recognise which ideas are yours to use and which you just need to let go of. You can't possibly bring to life every single idea that you have, and it can end in this inability to sleep, inability to step forward with anything, any idea, because it's just a complete overwhelm. Keeping journals will help with this processing, or voice notes, just to get them out of your head and onto paper in some way, and you will probably feel as you do that which ideas are correct and which ideas you need to leave behind. Leave them on paper. Don't let them stew in the mind. My best advice really for anyone who has an active mind is to start writing things down. Outside of the natal moon, what do we know the moon was doing on that day or that night that might have triggered a pattern off? You know, why that day? Why was it intense on that day? The other big planet for Heath that I haven't mentioned yet too much is Mars. Mars is his chart ruler. It's sat in the 12th house, a place that we often see shadow planets sitting. Now, as Mars moves through our birth chart, it can bring real volatility, impulsivity, recklessness, quick changes, not thinking about things, taking action without taking any thought, things bubbling out of nowhere. It really is a planet of impulsivity and aggressiveness. There's nothing really rational about Mars, really. Mars was sat in retrograde, so redoing and re-going over his 3rd house at the time of his death. We've been here before with the 3rd house. The 3rd house is the mind. So there was movement. He was re-going over things in his mind and mental health at the time, while there was a full moon, a known time for mental intensity. And his natal moon sat in the 3rd house. Another tragic transit combination. We actually see a lot of passings over those January moon cycles. Some of them also sit in fire energy, so depending at the time of year, it can be the Leo full moon, which we can track to see that there have been quite a lot of reckless or deaths from misadventure, accidental deaths from misadventure during that Leo full moon. And it's quite tragic to watch, actually. We can see the patterns start to play out. Secondly, the natal moon line running through his New York City. The moon is representative of our emotions. It's an intensely emotional line. And much like the moon with the tides, it will bring things to the surface that sometimes we'd rather were left hidden beneath the waves. This is a particularly difficult line to live on, especially for men, or spend prolonged amounts of time in, due to the emotional intensities that rise when we're there. It's a bit like living under a full moon permanently. It can be quite intense. So imagine having that build-up of emotions day in, day out. Now, on the shadow side, what we can sometimes see happening is people getting a bit addicted to that emotional intensity, especially when they work within the arts. This isn't so much of a problem, but it creates a disillusion within them. There's almost a struggle to see what's real and what's not. And people can get caught out on the moon line for succumbing to being addicted to the feeling, if you like, addicted to the emotional intensity. It's well linked to the energy of illusion, the moon. So this is about not seeing or not being able to see reality or truth as it plays out. This line is also particularly challenging, a particularly challenging one for men in relationships. The moon line is the mother line, and men can almost be under the spell of women or relationships under this line, or carry wounds from their childhood, and specifically their mother, into this space. It's very rarely conscious, and it's not the fault of the women, by the way. I need to kind of really emphasize that. What can often happen here is when relationships end, men can stay under the spell of the woman that they meet or live with within that space, and it can keep this emotional intensity and disillusion alive, perhaps even struggling to see the reality of the situation, not being able to access rational thought, for example. Basically, it's not a great combination for someone with a moon in the third house, creating an active and nocturnal mind who realistically could have done with sleep to keep his nervous system calm. Someone who needed more structure and discipline, but without the resources to be able to control that, and not understanding the shadows of their Mars and the Saturn lessons incoming, which wanted to teach structure, to teach discipline, to teach control and routine. So what else can we see about the moon in this situation? Well, in his birth chart, it sits sextile Chiron, which is in Taurus, and Saturn, which is in Virgo. It's a curious place for the feminine side of us to sit, in a deeply sensitive water sign, anchored to the home and security, sandwiched and supported by our deepest wounds to heal in this lifetime and our ability to father, or our father line. Saturn is also our greatest teacher in life. It's strict, it's controlling, it's limiting, all the things that Heath admittedly had a problem with feeling controlled or feeling limited. So let's backtrack to look at this in more detail a little bit, shall we? Heath was father to daughter Matilda, born 28th of October 2005, just over 2 years or so before his passing. Whenever people have children, I'm always really curious to see what the child's chart would trigger in their parents' chart. Often looking at what healing potential is held within that birth, that new life, how it interacts with the natural energy. So Matilda was born with the sun at 5 degrees Scorpio, while her moon was at 14 degrees Virgo. Now, you might remember, Heath's Saturn, the sign of the father, sat in Virgo, in complete opposition to his Venus line. This is important. We will come back to this later. Her sun, however, within this chart, triggers a curious reaction. It creates an incredibly beautiful trine, or support system, between Heath's natal moon, which is what seems to be causing his issues in New York City, Matilda's natal sun, which marks her birth, and Heath's Venus, which sits in Pisces, representing his love, his worth, his values in life. There's a lot of water, there is a lot of supportive water in there. So much moon energy. The moon is the ruler of water, and although it's the ruler of the sign of Cancer, we would also apply it to other water signs. So this is just such an incredible amount of potency in this New York line, this moon line where he lives. I can't even begin to explain. This is an intensely creative but deeply, deeply emotional energy which would require a lot of support to maintain long term. So my question really at this point, and it's a moot question, would be in terms of emotions, how good was Heath at recognising and processing emotions? Add into that the mix the fact that he's an emotional projector. This increases the need for emotional processing and emotional understanding, emotional support. And with that, what would be incredibly detrimental to someone who feels a lot of emotion and who needs to learn the skills to harness those emotions is anything that numbs emotion. So drugs, both prescribed and unprescribed, alcohol, addictive behaviours that stop us from feeling. So for example, being too busy to be able to feel. It's basically like turning off your intuition, leaving you floating through life without an anchor back to yourself, and disconnecting you from your authentic and true thoughts and feelings. It's really another recipe for emotional disaster. What we often see with emotional and energetic health is if it's not being dealt with properly, it'll show up in physical health problems. With the health symptoms of insomnia and a chest infection, I was always going to be looking at Gemini or the third house largely where the moon sits. It's It's this vicious cycle that begins to present itself. It seems bleedingly obvious to anyone observing and looking at the charts that New York wouldn't have been an easy place for him to live. And yet, he stayed there. He stayed there until the end. Why? And how? Anyone living on their moon line, it's an incredibly intense time for emotional processing, and if you aren't able to emotionally process, that is going to be really like shaking a fizzy pop bottle and leaving the lid on. At some point it's gonna blow. What would the solution have been? That's the balancing question, isn't it? What would the solution have been? For me, this is about choice and consequence. Firstly, I wouldn't be living on a moon line with that concoction of energy, and anyone who would come to me for a reading or maybe feeling like they're not in the right place, I would be looking at what's that place bringing up for them. Is there a shadow that we need to work through, or is it just not the right place at the right time for them whilst they go through these emotionally processing times? The only reason why I would potentially live on a moon line is if I was deeply attuned to moon cycles, but also had done my emotional work on myself to deal with emotional intensity on a daily basis. So where would have been better? Well, the sun line is usually a good call for most people. And with him having a strong Aries influence and suffering perhaps under the weight of emotions, a Mars line as well would have been a good option for some perspective, taking him out of the deeply challenging well of emotional depth and putting him on a Mars line, which is the complete opposite. Actually would have provided quite a lot of perspective and balance and confidence building and courage as well to deal with what he was dealing with at the time. And shadow work around the masculine energy. The other line favourable would have been Mercury for his Saturn returns, due to the Saturn placement in his natal chart and the direction it held for the potential that he could gain from it. More long term, I would also be tempted to look at the Neptune line for his creativity and creative development. However, there would need to have been moon lessons integrated, so emotional lessons, creative lessons, knowing when to stop, things like that I would recommend kind of after you've done that work. A Neptune line for someone who's creative and not necessarily materially driven is quite a nice line to live. So knowing he seemed to reside between the East Coast and the West Coast, my main question would really be around what was his health like on the West Coast in LA compared to the East Coast in New York. I obviously don't know those answers, but that would be my question. This might have started to hold a bit of a clue and give him an intuitive nudge if he was to notice a difference when he stepped outside of New York. The other interesting thing about Matilda's birth chart is Pluto and Venus sitting at 22 degrees of Sagittarius. There are two things here. Firstly, that Pluto and Venus combination is very powerful. Poor Matilda was always going to be in for a challenging time with this combination when it came to love. The combination of energy, or this combination of energy, sees death meet love, but also love holding the potential for deep transformation and development. It says death meets love at 22 degrees. And when did Heath die? He died on the 22nd of January. Death meets love at 22. The second part of this is where 22 degrees of Sagittarius sat in Heath's natal chart. Well, it sat just about to transit his natal Neptune, propped up by a trining Lilith. That's a lot of dark energy potential sat around Neptune, which is his creativity, his dreams, his sleep, with the shadows of Neptune very much being about trying to control the uncontrollable. There is nothing about Neptune energy that can be controlled. It's very much sitting in the realms of the unseen and the unknown. How can you measure and control that? And as I was researching this chart, I was watching the I Am Heath Ledger documentary, which is great, by the way. It's really real and very raw watch if you haven't seen it. In there, towards the end, one of his friends does mention the inability to be out of control, as in, even though this was someone who enjoyed taking risks and chances in life, this was also someone who needed to be somewhat in control of those risks. And if they weren't, they would try and regain control. With a Neptune placement being triggered into finding ways to control the situation outside of their control, and all of that dark energy there with Pluto and Lilith in the picture, this was a potential recipe for overload, emotional intensity, dark energy overload. There was also mention of him hating being controlled, especially by his career or his career choices. The word control kept creeping in and piquing my interest. It is the shadow of Saturn, a planet that is actually very important to this story. And at this point, I want to point out the synchronicities with human design and the gene keys. Each person has one gate or key that's the most important and powerful in the chart. It's the lens, basically, at which we view our entire lives through. This one gene key. It's our greatest asset and our greatest potential downfall too. Heath happens to be in gate 21, called the gate of control, affecting physically the lungs. This gate really speaks of the shadows on victimhoods of controlling, being controlled, and being in control. This overwhelming need to control all resources, and an inability on some level to surrender, to trust, or to ask for help. To quote Richard Rudd, who is the founder of the Gene Keys, ultimately, valor, which is the greatest gift of this gate, will be needed by all travellers into the beyond, because it takes valor to die with an open heart, to give up our identity, our attachments, our body, and merge it into limitless light requires the exquisite cocktail of courage and love. And that is a quote from Richard Rudd from 64 Ways, who is the founder of the Gene Keys. Valor means courage in the face of danger. Could this be speaking to courage in the face of danger when it came to the impending battle he was facing, and one where he potentially feared losing access to his 2-year-old daughter, which was very widely reported at the time? This would make sense, potentially, when we come back to the moon line and the moon placements and the teaching of his Saturn and his Mars in the shadow work. His moon line is an MC moon line running through New York. Why is this important? Well, from this place, he's really very sensitive to the court of public opinion. And with newspaper headlines about his relationship with Michelle and Matilda ongoing, I can imagine this would have created more emotional intensity along this line, which could trigger yet more insomnia, more nervous system issues, but also more sway towards emotional turbulence and the fallout of reckless behaviour from that. I want to just take a moment to illustrate his relationship with Michelle while we're here, actually. So with Heath's natal Venus sat in Pisces in the 11th house, he was always likely to meet someone through mutual networks or mutual friends, because that's a very 11th house placement thing to do for Venus. Two projectors, two very deep thinkers, both would define heads and third eyes. This is a super headstrong couple, which they're both going to have very stuck and stubborn views, and the shadow of this really is like it's two rams butting heads. Both very mentally stubborn, which when they're in flow very much works, because it's two very headstrong couple, a very headstrong couple, but when they're fighting in opposite directions, this is going to cause issues. What's interesting to me, though, is where they met. So according to sources, they met on the set of the Brokeback Mountain film, which was filmed across 3 locations: Wyoming and New Mexico in the USA, and Alberta in Canada. And guess what? Both Heath's Saturn and Venus line run through all 3 of these locations in one long continuous line. So this was always potentially going to be the place where he'd meet love. But it was also going to be the place where he'd meet his Saturnian lessons, his Saturn return lessons, to overcome and integrate in this lifetime. And it was going to be a relationship of soul growth for this reason on many levels. On the 22nd of January 2008, when Heath died, he was 28 years old. This is really significant. Those of you that are into astrology will already have the alarm bells ringing. You may not have heard of Saturn returns. It's actually really important in this story. As Saturn returns is a time of initiation into the rules and discipline and structure that we need around us in order to evolve into our soul plan and our highest elevation in this lifetime. It's a course corrector. It's a course corrector initiation in our lifetime. And it's also a time when we learn a lot of self-discipline. We all have one. None of us are exempt from it. We're all going to go through it. It happens when we're 28, 29 years old and continues in that pattern. So around 60 years old, around 90 years old. And it's a time of transformation. We really become adults at this point, and we are initiated into a whole host of Saturnian lessons. Lessons of effort, success, authority, hard work to create results. It's tough love is Saturn, and it can be extremely challenging if you don't understand it. Heath Ledger's natal Saturn sat in Virgo, directly opposed his Venus. Challenges were going to be present in this lifetime with choosing between romantic love and his craft. This was always going to be a choice in his destiny, to choose love or to choose the work, or to find a way to balance them between the two. That would require sacrifice on some level. Ultimately, in this case, he seemed to choose the work. Of course, we can't know the details of that, but I'm a firm believer in the polarities of both destiny and free will. When we exercise free will, we must deal with the consequences of our free will and the domino effect it can have on our lives. There's no right and wrong decision when it comes to it. There is just choice and consequence. And could one of the Saturn lessons have been around applying the same sheer grit and determination, the same discipline, to the same sacrifice as well to his love life, not just his career? And could that have been an emotional weight that was laying heavy, especially with a child involved? It's potential. Potentially that could have been something that was going on. It could also have been about making peace with choices instead of chasing the right or the perfect answer, because perfectionism is a real shadow of this Virgo placement. This need to get it right when in reality right and wrong doesn't exist. We just have choice and consequence. Heath Ledger died at his Saturn returns, and I really need to emphasise this, because it's a common time when we see people meet their ends in the world of celebrity and in normal life as well. A time when the lessons of Saturn would have been heightened, bringing a closure to the first 29 years of his life. Saturn was, in fact, within 1 degree of his natal Saturn. He was almost there. He was almost about to integrate the lessons and really feel them and really live with the consequences of whichever kind of angle he went down. And this, for me, is an important part of why I think this work that I'm doing with truly tragic transits is so important. In school, we are taught about riptides in the ocean, undercurrents dragging us under the water, making us gasp for air, holding invisible potential to threaten our lives. But we also know there's a way out of the rips and into safer water. Yes, the rips exist, but we can get out of them and we can learn to live with them, not just try and eradicate them. We can swim across them rather than through them to get to safe, dry land and then reflect, learn the lessons, etc. Astrology and astrocartography really help us to see the energetic riptides, places and times when we could be dragged under by life or where there's potential for danger. But with safe passages, it is possible to understand what exactly we're dealing with rather than just assuming that this is who we are, this is part of my personality. Is it, or is it that there's something energetically going on as well? Further lessons of this Saturn return would have been around creating more time to rest, more time to play, more time to find joy and enjoy freedom of his life. And, you know, with those jobs, he would have created some financial freedom, I'm sure. With a life so restricted by fame and intense headlines, this pressure could have been building. And with an undefined route, he would have been feeling an intense pressure to keep going and to keep working and to keep doing. With astrological guidance, this could have been worked through to understand on an energetic level, perhaps help guide Heath to greater self-mastery and understanding, rather than feeling heavy under the great weight and pressure of the emotional fallout from the last couple of years since his daughter was born. The final thing that I really want to explore is what the energy was over SoHo in New York at the approximate time of his death. Now, it's worth remembering we don't have an exact time of death due to the circumstances, but it's widely accepted to have been around 3 p.m. On the 22nd of January 2008 at 3 p.m, directly over New York, Uranus and Jupiter met. The planet of shock, of unpredictability, of instability, of shock waves, with the planet of expansion and growth. The energy over New York City at that moment was highly, highly unpredictable and highly volatile. It screams touch and go energy. It's a very risky time, one which literally decides at the roll of a dice, and sometimes the luck just runs out. On the approach was also the Pluto line, a line of death, rebirth and transformation. Could this cocktail of energy have amplified the darkness and heaviness of the natal moon, the emotional line, and handed the weighing scales of karma back to the universe? It seems likely with the Saturn returns that debts were being collected. It's also a time when we see people experience the end of their nodal opposition. You might have heard of the 27 Club. This is something that I am investigating in another episode in season 1. That is a nodal opposition. The 27 Club is real, but not for the reasons why the press and media kind of make out that it's real. So we'll look at that later. But it is a highly karmic time. These times don't always end up in death. You know, the debts collected, the karmic weighing scales being rebalanced, doesn't always end up in death. But when you've ignored your intuition for so long, numbing, escaping, suppressing, there's going to be a time when the body can only take so much and the soul moves on. And this is the whole point in choice and consequence. What are my choices? What is the consequence of my choices? And having to live with that, having to live with those lessons. We see moments of self-implosion at this time. Lessons collected, potentials observed. So in terms of truly tragic transits, what do we have here? This is someone who died at their Saturn returns, a time when we're asked to live with the consequences of our actions, a time when we're handed a dollop of discipline, a dollop of restriction, made to behave, basically, and a time when we collect the aprons for the next chapter of life under that choice as well. This is a person who lived and died on their moon MC line, a moon line that was deeply challenging and really heightened the sensitivity to public scrutiny as well. At a time when their physical body was showing signs of what I'm calling moon sickness from within their astrological chart, pointing towards issues with their emotional processing. On a date heavily etched into the chart of their daughter, arguably their greatest achievement, the number 22. The same daughter, Matilda, having one yod or finger of God in her chart, pointing to the moon in Virgo, in her 9th house, the teaching of adventure and misadventure. His death largely linked to the moon line and moon placements, and he also passed away on his moon line after an emotionally intense and turbulent time living there. Matilda also holding the Uranus-Saturn quincunx in her chart, indicating shocking events around her father, Uranus being the transiting line he died on. And the story of a celebrity dying on a numerological 9-year, a natural time for endings, when one story ends and the potential for a new one begins, if we can overcome the challenges of the endings first, and accept and integrate the lessons rather than suppress and try to control them. So, what can we learn from this? Well, opportunities, for whatever reason, and completely without blame, were missed around the emotional insensitivity of that moon line, the moon natal placement and the emotional projector nature of Heath, and the rising emotional tide of being on the MC line, where everyone wants to build you up or tear you down through emotional manipulation. Could this information have saved him from his brush with destiny? Potentially. The potential energy was there to spot and there to be communicated. It would have required psychological help, of course, a support system, a deep understanding of emotional energy, but the lessons were clearly there, the timeline was there, and the obstacles laid out to overcome were also there. So there was a map, we just didn't see the rest of it play out in real time. We only saw the ending. Looking at this data, it makes me really uncomfortable, actually, that human design, astrology and astrocartography isn't more widely accepted to help advise people on their shadows and potential for problematic locations, especially within their life. Could Heath's life have been saved through this help with the intense emotions that he would have been feeling at New York, in New York City and at that location? I personally believe so. You know, if you move away from a moon line and you realise you feel a lot better and then you move back onto it, the indications are quite clearly there. The difficulty is trying to explain it to people. Sometimes it's not always things that we control. But if we can be aware of certain places bringing up challenges, or we can at least get a heads up on the energetic tide that's incoming rather than getting swept out to sea on the rogue waves. We can also make a choice as to whether we are ready for those lessons yet or not. It's not about avoidance, but it is about foresight. It's not about control, but it's about surrendering and understanding and allowing yourself to feel. So, what do you think? What do you think about him living on that line? What do you think about all the evidence that you've heard for how we could have prevented this tragic death through the truly tragic transit that was happening? What about looking at astrology, moon cycles, astrocartography as a way of death, accidental death, suicide prevention? What do you think? With that, we come to the end of today's episode. Thank you so very much for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and rate this podcast to help others find it with the pesky algorithm. And I'm always a good fan of the old-fashioned share with your friends if you think they'll enjoy this episode too, if you think it will get them thinking, if you think it will help them to understand perhaps someone in their life and what they're going through, or for themselves. I'm on a mission to bring more awareness to energetic tides and patterns so we can live in greater understanding and harmony rather than suppression and confusion. So please help me do that by doing free things like liking, rating, sharing and promoting. They don't cost you any money, they just cost you a little bit of time. In the next episode, if you've enjoyed this, of Truly Tragic Transits, I'll be exploring the death of Whitney Houston, an idol for me, and what exactly was going on during that fateful stay in the Beverly Hills Hotel in 2012. Until then, keep an eye on the transits, because you never know what keys they might hold. Goodbye.